Well, Happy New Year. Wednesday night Bible study, First Baptist Church of Jasper, Georgia, 2021. New year, new possibilities, new ways of learning how to, new opportunities to learn how to be people of faith. And so over the last few months, we've looked at different parts of Scripture. And from time to time, we're going to be looking outside the Scriptures on Wednesday nights. And to look at different historical things, different aspects that relate to our faith, to make us who we are, or to learn about our past and learn how it gives us identity and purpose and makes us appreciate what we do now in the present. So over the next 4 weeks, we are going to be looking at the faith of the United States colonies. We're going to be looking back at our heritage, things we did well, things we could learn from, and just to help us or give us some identity, give us appreciation for our forefathers and mothers. And so we have to go back and do a little background, but we'll be looking at different parts. Tonight we're going to be looking at the southern colonies, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. But to begin with, in the 16th and the 17th century, France, Spain, and Portugal began to move west to build an empire in the Americas. From previous discoveries, they realized there was land in this area and that they wanted to come and they wanted to build and wanted to start over again. So in the 17th century, Great Britain began to move west and build their empire. Why did they come? So we know they came for gold, came looking for land to grow things like tobacco and rice and cotton and different corn. They came for trade purposes. They came for religious motives that we'll kind of talk about later. They came to make money. So as they came west, they began to interact with this new group of people, the Native Americans. And some of the colonists, some of the countries tried to be at peace with them and work with them, trade with them, buy and sell things. Some wanted to use the Indians for labor. Some wanted to pay them. Some wanted to not pay them for their labor. Some did far worse to the natives. And there were different types of people who came within these countries. There were aristocrats. There were middle-income people that had some means, and there were probably some folks that didn't have many means at all. And they wanted to start over. So, but also going on within the last several hundred years within Europe was that the government and the church were very intertwined. And oftentimes churches or countries were seen as a Catholic country, a Protestant country. And so people within that country had to conform to that perspective of the faith. And if they didn't, there oftentimes were small groups that might have tried to do it a different way, but they were often found to be harassed, persecuted, if not worse, and they often had to flee. And so it was hard to experience any kind of a religious freedom if you moved from one country to the next. You had to conform to that strand of the faith, that tradition, I should say. So as we look at these southern colonies, let's look at Virginia first. There were several attempts to colonize in Virginia by the English, and a lot of those experiments failed. The first permanent full-time settlement was Jamestown in 1607. And a chaplain among the settlers wanted to set up the Church of England, and for both the natives and the settlers to be able to practice their faith. So, but the colony was not so much for religious purposes. It was to block the Spanish from coming north. The Spanish were in Florida, And, each country was wondering if they didn't get and move and establish a charter over land, that other countries could begin to move into their area or close to their areas. So Virginia was there for a buffer, but it was also there for economic reasons, to trade with the Indians, to farm. Now, the founding of Virginia was at the high point of Puritanism. So even though the Church of England was being established, you had this other strand of faith, this other tradition within the Christian world. And so there were some early laws, Puritan laws, that were set up. Some of these laws, for instance, were like you had to attend worship 2 times a day. 2 times a day, that's a lot of time. That's a lot of church. I don't know how comfortable I would be going 2 times a day. There was a strict observance of the Lord's Day. So that meant that not only did you go, but that you didn't do any work. And you could face fines or punishment for working. And there was a stern punishment for profanity or immodest dress. So King James, who was very tied to the Church of England, detested Puritanism and what was going on in Europe with Puritans pushing back and trying to control, assert themselves within England. That during 1622 there was an Indian war within Virginia, and King James took control of Jamestown, and the Puritanism began to fade a little bit in its influence. But Charles I continued that, pushing out or trying to, pushing out a lot of that Puritan influence. And he did that by taking a portion of Virginia and making Maryland and giving it to a Catholic proprietor. So tried to push the Puritans to go north. But during this time, Puritanism faded on its own. There was a lot of economic boom from agriculture, the importance of the importing of slaves allowed the economy to boom even more, and Puritanism began to see its way out in Virginia. A lot of the settlers were tied to the Church of England, but it was more for the settlers who were of the aristocratic nature, the wealthier ones. This wasn't a place for poor whites or slaves. And in England, you couldn't be a member of the church if you owned slaves. But within the colonies, they passed laws to allow for a member of a church to be tied to the church, but still own slaves. There was not much emphasis on the owners of the people who owned slaves to teach the slaves the importance of faith, to teach them anything about faith. So I imagine some did, but there was just not a lot of emphasis within the Church of England to do that. A lot of your poor whites did not have a place to worship. Some fled to Catholic Maryland. Some would flee into where there was a religious freedom, and some would flee into the Carolinas, as we'll talk about in a little bit. The Quakers made some inroads in Virginia, and so did the Methodists. Began to do that. Carolinas. So we're going to go from one state to the next. Was given to the Crown gave the Carolinas, North Carolina and South Carolina, to some aristocrats and stockholders in 1663. And these folks encouraged people to immigrate there, and the way they did it is they said, we'll give you religious freedom. We're not going to set up an official kind of church within our colony. So a lot of poor folks began to flee to the Carolinas. However, the Church of England, for the aristocrats who were there, had a stronghold, and was able to they were able to practice their faith. the Quakers and the Baptists. Hey, we made some inroads here. Attracted the lower class. But there were still many that did not have any faith tradition that were allowed to still work and not have to adhere to any kind of faith laws or anything like that, where they would have to in Europe, or laws that were tied to the faith. Georgia, good old Georgia. The basic purpose for Georgia was to, again, as we talked about Virginia creating that buffer, as they were able to grab hold of Georgia, the English, this was a buffer to keep the Spanish, to lock the Spanish into just Florida and not allow them to come up and try to assert their control in any other areas. So Georgia was set up as a buffer, but in 1732, James Oglethorpe asked for this colony not just to be a buffer, but a place for debtors, for incarcerated debtors or other criminals to be sent to this state. So, but this place also, like the Carolinas, was a haven for religious refugees. There was religious freedom in the area. Now, the Church of England still was probably the official religion, but it did not have as much impact, and it was very confined to just a few areas, probably the port cities like Savannah. Then the Wesley brothers, John Wesley, Charles Wesley, who once worked within the Church of England, who became Methodist and became a big proponent, became in a lot of ways a big push to form the Methodist Church, the United Methodist Church, or not at the time, at the moment it was the Methodist Church. It became the United Methodist Church later. But they were a part of the inroads of the Anglican. They were once, at that time, Anglican pastors that tried to set up churches within that area. The Moravians had some success. They were a small Christian sect that had some success in this area. And John Wesley had some interaction with the Moravians. Was very formative in his understanding of faith. But they made some inroads, and the Baptists came later, and the Methodists came later. But this was just really in the 17th century, where England was setting up the colonies and form. But next week we will begin to look at. Let me look at my calendar. The northern colonies, and hope this was informative. To me, I love history. History is just so important to know who we are and to know our past, and it gives us appreciation for what we do now. So, I hope it's informative. Maybe it has inspired you to read a bit more about the formation of the colonies and how faith was involved. But we're going to be talking about Methodist and Baptist and different faith traditions as we move up into the other parts of the colonies. So look forward to seeing you next week, and begin doing your research on your own, and maybe send me some messages on the Facebook page and some interesting things you find. It's just some fascinating stuff. So talk at you next week.